Beena Sharma, so good to see you.
Hi. Hi, Corey. So
Yeah.
lovely, yes, to be here. Thank
Yeah, I'm super excited. We've been wanting to have this conversation as sort of a series, part of a series of conversations that we wanted to get to for a very, very long time now. So I'm glad that we were able to carve out this time to
Me
spend
too.
together and to spend with our audience. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Me too. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, just to kind of get us started, I feel like I can't really start this conversation without sort of acknowledging what's going on in the world right now. So, as most people probably know by now, just last night there was an assassination attempt on former President Trump, and this is just sending shockwaves, I think, across the world right now as we speak. And we're having this conversation sort of in the midst of all of this.
Yes. Yeah.
And, we're still learning about the possible motivations of the shooter and, all the other details. There's always sort of a fog of war that comes with these, so we're still awaiting a lot of details. But we can definitely say for certain that this was just such a deplorable, cowardly, reprehensible act, un-American act in so many ways. And really, it's a clear indicator, I think, of just how fractured and fragmented and really polarized this culture has become, particularly our political culture, which to me foregrounds really just how desperately we need a new vision of wholeness in this culture, in this country, in this world, both in our personal lives as well as in our, overall sense making and our various governing institutions. And by that, I specifically do mean the particular kinds of wholeness that Ken Wilber is talking about in his most recent book, the kinds of wholeness that we discover through, the paths of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, opening up, and showing up. And there's another kind of wholeness, too, that I think is sort of implicitly woven through all of those, which is the kind of wholeness that we experience by learning how to manage and harmonize and integrate polarities, which really helps us create new kinds of wholeness pretty much wherever we go. And without these different kinds of paths of wholeness, my fear is that we're really left only to the painful kind of brokenness that we so often feel in our hearts and we so often see in the world around us. The world will just continue to become more polarized. Acts of violence, political violence, such as this that we saw last night, I think are likely to become more common. And it's just such a, precarious place for our country to be right now. And as luck would have it, we're actually here to talk about exactly one of these critical paths of wholeness, namely the path of growing up, which explores the idea of vertical development through these multiple stages of maturation. And when it comes to applying these stages to our overall self-organization and just to our own sense-making, I always find myself going back to something that Ken said years ago, which is the goal is to allow every stage to be itself, always, while also governing from the highest or latest stages available to us. I just think that is such a profound and clear sort of instruction in terms of how we're supposed to hold vertical development. And so today we're really going to get into the idea of vertical development, which I think is just central, obviously, to that path of growing up. And I look forward to discussing this with you today.
Yeah.
Because I think it's more clear than ever that this idea, this particular path to wholeness, is one that the world just simply can no longer live without. So I've got a list of questions that will sort of guide this conversation as we go. But before we begin, I'm just wondering if there's any introductory comments that you'd like to make here at the top.
Yeah, just in response to what you said, for me, I think the bigger question is, how do I practice this?
Yeah.
It's really a practice, In a way, I started with learning about it as a framework, as a way to interpret emergent reality, as a lens to understand meaning making, as a self observation lens. But it feels like now it's more of how do I practice it? So even the quote that you said of Ken, how would I know? How would I know what is my later stage capacity? Do I have a name for it? How do I know that I am not operating from there? How do I know that I'm falling back? How do I interpret what is going on from this understanding of the stages? And I think that's critical to practicing vertical development. So I think it's taken me a while to understand how important it is for us to deeply appreciate the landscape and the constellation of each stage. So then we can bring it in service of our development. So I think that's my comments based
That's
on
great.
what you said.
That's well said, and it sets us up because we'll be talking a little bit later in this conversation about some of those practices, some of those methods of applying vertical development again to ourselves and sort of to our perception of the world around us. So thank you for that. That sets us up nicely. So I think to begin, Beena, you've been in this field for over 30 years now. And I think one of the things I'm really curious about, and our audience is likely curious about too, is just what got you started, right? What really initially drew you to the field of vertical development in the first place? And how has your understanding of vertical development sort of evolved over time as you have evolved over time?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, the second one. Well, how I got started is just by being interested in learning and growing. And I recalled only recently that my mom used to use the word immature for some people a lot. So somehow I felt she inculcated in me this idea of maturity. And she would say, oh, that's immature. And then, so I began to gravitate towards more mature ways of being without knowing it, without calling it that. And through my own work, which was first external, it was initially more focused on intellectual development and then got more interested in inner process. Through that work, my own vertical growth was happening, but I didn't know it was happening and I didn't know how it was happening. So I think I really came upon this first with Ken's work. I mean, just naming the stage framework and that we go through these stages, it explained my life. It explained so many things. It was mind-blowing. I mean, the whole integral framework explained my life in many ways. You know, how I started off with different lines and how then I started including other lines, and then I could recognize in myself the precise moment when I felt I moved from achiever, stage 4, self-determining, to the first post-conventional stage. So when I began, all of these pennies started dropping, and it became the most interesting thing for me. And because my profession is learning and development, and I'm personally interested in it, this has become the most comprehensive reference point for me. And I think what has changed is initially it was more of a reference point, and now it is more of a practice. It's not just what are the practices for vertical development, but vertical development as a living practice. So I feel that's more how I live it in a way today. And I think it was more focused earlier. I mean, I was more focused earlier on the later stages. And I feel more and more I'm more interested in the foundational stages that have formed me. And I remember having a conversation with Dr. Keegan once, and I was surprised. I was working with a company in Brazil, and he was my consultant, and we were doing this project. And he was very clear. He said, my focus is on moving people from socialized to self-authoring. He really wasn't concerned about self-transforming. He said, this is what the world needs. And more, I feel like, because in our framework, the biggest milestone or one of the, like Keegan focuses on socializing to self-authoring. For us, it is focusing on from self-authoring or from self-determining stage 4 to actually getting into early post-conventional. So I feel more and more that's my focus, and it's bringing me a lot of clarity on what are the things we can do to support people to become more and more sort of post-conventional broadly, especially because most of our clients are in the conventional world. You know, we work with organizations, we work with leaders, we work with coaches who work with leaders who are primarily at the self-authoring stage. So we are interested in that cusp. And that's, I think, another shift for me. And I also feel that initially it was harder for me to work with earlier stages. It felt, because I hadn't integrated, not that I've completely integrated that even now, but I hadn't quite befriended my own inner earlier stages, and now that I'm more friendly with them, I can be more friendly with people who embody some of those things that, it would help them to move from a limiting perspective to a more liberating perspective. Yeah, and I think it feels like more of a living process now. I also see the framework really as, it's like every human being instantiates the framework in a unique way. So
Yeah.
it comes alive. And so I feel it's my responsibility to read and to sense and to appreciate how this process, how it evolves, how we grow. And it's so different in different people. And it's a real privilege to get a group of people together and to have these conversations with the support of the assessment, where then it becomes very alive. It's a living process. We're seeing it show up in the moment. And the kind of learning that happens in the collective dialogue, there is no substitute for that. You can't read enough, you can't listen enough to have some of those invisible landings, that happen as a result of those conversations. So I think that's a bit of how it's different today for me.
That's gorgeous. And I really resonated with a lot of what you just said, just in my own sort of story through Integral, to Integral and through Integral, right? I noticed early on that when I first started getting into this work, it really brought so much clarity sort of in the rear view mirror, right? I could look back and be like, okay, I can now see when I made this transition from like an umber to an orange self-identity, and when I shifted from an orange to a green cognition. And, it was so much easier to see those sort of fulcrums, again, in the rear view mirror, sort of retroactively. It was more difficult to sort of gauge where I was at the, I'm 20 something years old. I've got all sorts of delusions of grandeur that just kind of come with being in my early 20s. A lot of developmental bypassing, spiritual bypassing and all that, which made it more difficult to sort of assess where am I now and where am I heading. But I could see those prior fulcrums. Say again?
I'm sorry. That doesn't stop, by the way.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
I had to say that. Yeah.
But, there's that piece that you mentioned about, like, really sort of reintegrating, reconsolidating, recontacting these prior stages that are still alive within us, right? I think that's a big point, is that a lot of people, they're so focused on, and maybe we'll get to some of this a little bit later with some of the myths and some of the challenges around development, but they're so focused on sort of reaching up and grabbing that next handhold and pulling themselves up. And, you've got this beautiful metaphor, Beena, that we've talked about so much in the past, where development isn't just a sort of a ladder, right? It's more like a climbing wall that's got a number of handholds and footholds that are distributed across multiple different kinds of intelligence, multiple paths of development that we're engaged in at all times. And one of the reasons why I named this episode Ready, Steady, Grow, I mean, it's kind of cute and, sort of a nice colloquial phrase to use, but each of those terms really is deeply metaphoric to me. Like, ready refers to a growth mindset that we need to bring to this work in the first place. Steady means really shoring up and making sure that our footholds that are supporting our weight in the developmental process are solid, sturdy, and strong enough to hold us up as we then reach up to that third word, grow, in order to pull us up to the next stages. And it feels like so many people are just so fascinated with the idea of growth and really see it as an achievement that I need to hit in my future, that they just focus on the handholds and not much on the footholds. And I get this like cartoon image in my head of someone who makes it to the top of the wall and their upper body is just all beefed out and their legs are just like little scrawny strands of spaghetti underneath them. And that's not a very well balanced way of growing up. Both of these are important, both sort of cognizing and reaching forward into the next stages of unfolding in our own lives, but also constantly coming back and reintegrating and realigning ourselves with these prior stages, because they're always here, and we probably spend a majority of our time at those prior stages. I think that's another thing, is that people are never at a stage. They're sort of bouncing around depending on context and what they're doing, who they're talking to, etc. All of which is to say is I really resonated with so much of what you just said.
Yeah, I like that metaphor of the upper body built out and spindly legs. I recognize myself in that actually.
Yeah,
I do.
100%.
Yeah, I do. And I also want to say that vertical development is not a goal.
Right. Right.
It's an outcome. It's an outcome of the living process. It's an outcome of how we're living, how we make sense of what's going on inside, how we make sense of what's going on outside, and the conscious choices we bring, the unconscious patterns we bring. It's, in the cauldron of all of that, vertical development is happening, and we forget that the grand source, if you might call, of the development is not us. It's the ultimate presence, the ultimate reality, nature moving us towards an evolution, and that it's an evolutionary process. So we tend to appropriate the forces of nature, actually, and claim that we are the ones that are doing the developing. So I love to keep that in mind, that we are participating in it to some extent, consciously, to a large extent, not in very aware ways, but the larger forces are operating. It's the force that makes your hair grow. That's the force.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And I think it's important to remember that.
Yeah. And that gets us, I think, to Keegan's point, which is, really ultimately it may turn out that Integral's greatest contribution to the world isn't so much pulling people from green through that momentous leap into teal and turquoise, but rather pulling people from amber and umber, the skill-centric stage, into orange, into self-authorship, because that is where the conveyor belt of today's world is completely broken down. Right? That's where spirituality is not allowed to mature past amber. And so, so it creates this ever widening gap that we see in our culture wars and in our politics and, in news stories such as we saw last night. We see this seismic gap between these particular stages. And, I think a big calling, something that is calling integral people forward, isn't just to sort of lay the foundations for this new emerging stage that's coming through. Yes, that's there too. There's an emergent aspect of integral that's critical here, but there's also sort of the universal donor aspect that I think Claire Graves liked to talk about in Spiral Dynamics, which is, integralists can be something like chameleons. And we can sort of get ourselves into those gaps between these stages to try to kind of pull things back together again in a skillful way, and creating processes and creating new kinds of unfoldment where people can actually start finding common ground again, which is something that we haven't, I think, really had in plentiful supply in our culture for at least 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I would agree with that.